the statement will be both in Italian and then in English. Buonasera a tutti. Non so se è il caso già adesso, Lucia, di dare le istruzioni rispetto all'utilizzo dei sottotitoli questa sera. Ognuno di voi nella barra di Meet vede una serie di strumenti e ci sono 2 C all'interno di un quadrato. Ecco, bisogna cliccare per avere la traduzione simultanea dall'inglese all'italiano su quelle 2 C, impostare poi nella tabella dei sottotitoli che esce nella parte più a sinistra la lingua inglese, nella finestrina accanto mettere sottotitoli tradotti e poi all'opposto, diametralmente opposto, c'è una rotellina con le impostazioni. Bisogna cliccare su quella rotellina e inserire la lingua preferita, perché altrimenti avete una traduzione della prima lingua in ordine alfabetico che è presente, cioè l'Afrikaans, e non penso che sia una lingua commestibile per nessuno. Se ci sono problemi, fate senz'altro presenti, insomma. Io vi do, potete magari provare a vedere adesso un attimo se funzionano con l'italiano. Vi do, in qualità di presidente del Centro Culturale Transconfessionale Polilogos, il benvenuto all'incontro di questa sera, che vede come ospite la dottoressa Eline Huygens, spero di averlo pronunciato bene, sociologa, ricercatrice alla Katholieke Universiteit Leuven e all'Università di Utrecht. All'interno del percorso di approfondimento dei temi della secolarizzazione, che fa parte appunto del semestre che stiamo concludendo, oggi ci confrontiamo con una questione particolarmente complessa e molto interessante, e cioè come è vissuta l'affettività da parte delle giovani cattoliche, in particolare nelle Fiandre. Mi permetto di fare solo una veloce considerazione di tipo storico-politico. Io sono uno studioso di storia delle istituzioni politiche, sui processi di secolarizzazione in Belgio, dei quali è possibile apprezzare una manifestazione guardando proprio ai risultati elettorali di uno dei 2 partiti che fino al 1968 formavano il Partito Sociale Cristiano Unitario, che era appunto l'insieme di 2 partiti, l'omonimo partito Vallone e del Partito Popolare Cristiano Fiammingo. Io ho stampato per non presentare quelli che sono appunto i risultati elettorali, l'evoluzione dei risultati elettorali dei cristiano-democratici fiamminghi, che è il nome assunto dal 2001 dal Partito Popolare Cristiano delle Fiandre, dal 1945 al 2015. È una cartina presa da questo bel libro di Pascal Delvit, La vita politica in Belgio dal 1930 ai giorni nostri, in francese, edito dall'Università di Bruxelles. È un'immagine, come potete vedere dalla linea discendente, è un'immagine che parla da sé, ma ho ritenuto che potesse aiutare appunto a visualizzare in questa linea discendente, visualizzare schematicamente in un'ottica di contesto, per quanto limitata appunto alla sfera politica, il dispiegarsi dei processi di secolarizzazione che hanno una dimensione politica, peraltro con una caratura non solo belga, tra l'altro poi un paese nato da una rivoluzione che vide un attivo protagonismo politico dei cattolici, ma è appunto trasversale a tutta l'Europa e a tutti i paesi che, come il Belgio, hanno visto un protagonismo attivo di partiti di ispirazione cristiana. Stasera invece appunto questi temi non saranno questi qui, ma saranno approfonditamente considerati dal punto di vista socio-religioso, con un'attenzione specifica alle Fiandre, che però, appunto, come nel caso dei processi politici, è suscettibile di trasferirsi ha una dimensione transnazionale, è di nuovo europea. Procedo ora a fare questi medesimi saluti in inglese, dopodiché, ringraziando Lucia Battistelle e l'ospite, lascerò la parola appunto alla professoressa Lucia Battistelle, che modererà l'incontro di stasera. I may now proceed in English. As president of the Interfaith Cultural Center Polylogos, I would like to welcome you to this event, whose guest and keynote speaker is Dr. Eline Huygens, a sociologist and researcher at the Katholieke Universiteit Leuven and at the University of Utrecht. Today we address a highly complex issue within our journey into the themes of secularization, namely how young Catholic women experience intimate life, in particular in Flanders. Before handing the floor, as a young scholar of history of political institutions, I would like to make just a brief observation of political history regarding the processes of secularization in Belgium. An illustration of such processes can be seen by looking at the election results of one of the two parties which, until 1968, formed the Unitary Christian Social Party, which was the combination of the two parties which, of the homonymous Walloon Party with the Flemish Christian People's Party. The graph here shows the evolution of the electoral performance from 1945 to 2015 of the Christian Democratic and Flemish, which is the name adopted in 2001 by the Christian People's Party of Flanders. It is a picture with a progressively lowering line. It is a picture that speaks for itself, but I thought that it might be helpful in providing a broad overview, albeit limited to the political sphere, of how the processes of secularization unfold. These processes, they have a political dimension, and one that extends beyond Belgium, whose national revolution witnessed the active political subjectivity of Catholics as well, but one also that cuts across the whole of Europe and all countries that have seen Christian-inspired parties play an active role. Instead, today, Dr. Huygens will help us clarifying these issues from another perspective, a perspective of social and religious studies, with a specific focus on Flanders. However, as with political processes, their relevance may extend also to a transnational and European dimension. And maybe this is a point that could form a point of discussion this evening. I want to thank again our guest for being here, and I want to thank Professor Lucia Battistelle as well. And Lucia Battistelle is going to chair this meeting. Therefore, I shall at once yield the floor to her. Prego, Lucia.
Many thanks, Filippo. If it's okay, if everyone has activated the captions, I'm going to speak in English so that we don't we give the floor then directly to Eline. With no, I don't want to speak too much, but let me just say once again that it's a pleasure to welcome Dr. Huygens with us and have her with us tonight. So many thanks. Like Filippo said, she conducts research at the intersection of religious studies and gender studies, and in particular that's the topic she's going to delve into today. She has carried out qualitative research on the internet lives of young women in Belgium and on parenting experiences in Belgium and in the Netherlands. And she is currently affiliated with Leuven and is managing editor also of many of the very prestigious international academic journal, Religion and Gender. We can say that what emerges from her research and academic interests is a picture of a lived Catholicism as something which we can call, I think, dynamic and dialogical, shaped not only by doctrine, but also by personal experience. So I think it's very, very interesting. And today she invites us, I think, to rethink how we understand religion in practice, especially in relation to intimacy. Eline, Dr. Huygens, thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Thank you, and buonasera. That's my only Italian. There it stops, but buonasera, and very nice that I'm invited here. The lecture I will present today is based on my doctoral research, which I carried out between 2017 and 2023 at Ghent University and KU Leuven. And in this project, I conducted qualitative research into the intimate lives of young Catholic women in Flanders. More specifically, I was interested in exploring how these women navigate relationships, sexuality, intimate life, and religion in a society that explicitly presents itself as secular. And this is also a somewhat unusual focus in contemporary scholarship, as research on religion, and particularly on the intersections of religion and gender, tends to concentrate mainly on religious minority traditions, such as Islam. By contrast, there is relatively little empirical research on the lived experiences of Catholic women, despite the fact that Catholicism still has a strong historical and cultural presence in Flanders. And the decision to focus on Catholic women was therefore very deliberate. With this research, I wanted to shed light on how Catholic women today position themselves in relation to religion, intimacy, and identity within a self-declared secular society, a society that often sees active religiosity and as something belonging to the past. Next slide, please. Thank you. For the structure of the lecture, I will begin by briefly outlining the methodological approach of the study. I will then say something about the social and cultural context in which this research is conducted. And after that, I will turn to the empirical material itself. Of course, it's impossible to cover 6 years of research in a single lecture. There's a lot to say about my research and about the findings I discovered, but I will focus on 4 key themes that repeatedly emerged in my interviews. And these are first, experience of being an outsider in society. Secondly, the importance of friendships. Thirdly, the role of family. And finally, romantic relationships. And together, these themes allow us to see how religion is not something abstract or detached from everyday life, but is deeply embedded in intimate relationships and affective bonds. So that is something I would like to explore with you today. Next slide, please. So this talk is based on an empirical study that takes inspiration from what is known as a lived religion approach. Can the next slide be put on, please? Thank you. So instead from starting from official church doctrines or institutional texts, lived religion looks at religion as it is actually practiced in everyday life. So in other words, what people do that they themselves experience as religious, the rituals they engage in, the symbols they use, and the practices that shape their daily lives. So for this study, I conducted qualitative research among Catholic women between the ages of 25 and 35. All of them live in Flanders, and all of them are actively involved in the Catholic Church. And this focus was very deliberate. By speaking with women who were active in the Church, I was able to engage with people who show a certain loyalty and commitment towards the Catholic Church and Catholicism. So between 2019 and 2021, I conducted 42 in-depth interviews with women who identify themselves as Catholic. Almost all of these interviews took place in the women's own homes, which often created a calm and familiar atmosphere, ideal for conversation. I recruited participants through my personal and professional networks, and at the end of each interview, I also asked whether they knew other Catholic women who might be interested in participating. This means to some extent that I use the snowball sampling method. It is important to note that the group of women I interviewed was quite homogeneous. All of them were white, and most came from a middle-class background in terms of education, income, and living arrangements. All of them had completed higher education, either a bachelor's or a master's degree, and almost all of them had a paid job outside the house. The vast majority identified as heterosexual. About 1/3 of the women were single at the time of the interview, while the others were in long-term relationships or married. Even among the women who were single, there was a strong desire for a romantic relationship, preferably with a Catholic partner, and for a Catholic marriage. I will also briefly reflect on my own position as a researcher. I personally identify as non-religious. At the same time, I share many identity markers with the women I interviewed. Age, gender, class, level of education, lifestyle, ethnicity, sexual orientation. And this overlap helped to create a sense of equality and mutual trust. For example, sharing the same gender identity and expression made it easier to talk openly about gendered and sexual experiences. At the same time, my distance from the church also played an important role. Although I was raised Catholic, I'm neither a practicing nor active Catholic in church today, and several women explicitly told me that this made them feel more comfortable sharing certain experiences, precisely because they knew I was not part of their parish and they would never meet me again in settings such as the church or the parish. Next slide, please. We already had some social background from Filippo, but I will say something briefly about it as well. So to understand this research, it's important to say a few things about the context. Flanders is generally described as a secular society. So over the past decade, strong processes of secularization have taken place, both at the level of the institutions and at the level of individual belief. So for example, also in voting behavior, as we saw in the graph. And this has also affected people's trust in the Catholic Church. At least in terms of self-image, Flanders presents itself as fully secularized, and gender equality and sexual freedom are often portrayed as a proof that secularization has been successfully achieved. At the same time, several scholars and sociologists of religion have argued that this image is somewhat misleading. Flanders may present itself as secular, but it's still deeply rooted in a Catholic past. Just to give a few examples, the majority of schools and many healthcare institutions are still Catholic institutions. The influence of Catholicism in Flemish culture and everyday life should not be underestimated. And religious studies scholar Nella van den Brandt has referred to this as Catholic secularity, a term that captures this contradiction quite well. We see it clearly in public debates, but also in mundane everyday practices. One of my interviewees, Margot, described her family as what she called, and I quote her, Christmas tree Christians. And I think this is actually very fitting descriptions for many Flemish people. They put up a Christmas tree, they have a brunch at Easter, but they don't go to church and they don't really have an active religious identity, practice, or life. Now, in this complex and somewhat ambivalent relationship between Catholicism and secularism, public debates and academic research tend to focus mainly on marginalized groups. Interestingly enough, Catholic women themselves have largely been left out of the picture. One of my interlocutors, Marjorie, summarized this feeling as, and I quote her, "We simply don't seem to exist." And perhaps somewhat paradoxically, given the still privileged position of Catholicism in Belgian society, One of the key findings of my study is that many of the women I interviewed reported strong feelings of isolation and loneliness. Next slide, please. Yes, thank you. So several of my interviewees described feeling constantly in between their religious aspirations and the secular society they live in. Pina put it this way, and I'll quote her. "It's always difficult because you're religious, but you also live in the society. You always feel torn. You have to choose this or that. Well, we are neither fish nor fowl," she said, laughing. And with this expression, she pointed to a feeling that many other women also articulated, the sense of not fully belonging. Many of them regularly encountered negative views about religion and the Catholic Church at work, at school, or among non-religious friends or non-religious family members. Religion is often described to them as conservative, old-fashioned, outdated, especially when it comes to gender and sexuality. Scandals surrounding sexual abuse within the church also play an important role in shaping these perceptions. And as a result, some women told me that they actively hide or downplay their religious identity, especially in new social settings. Stephanie, for example, said to me, and I quote, "It's something I will not say until I have gained their trust. So saying that she's religious or Catholic is something she will not say until she has gained trust." And combined with the declining number of practicing Catholics and the fact that they often have to explain or justify their lifestyle, this contributes to a strong feeling of being an outsider. One of my interlocutors, Ilse, described it as feeling like being an alien. And I want to focus on this sense of otherness to highlight something important, the role of relationships with other Catholics. Despite the strong institutional presence of Catholicism in areas such as healthcare and education, personal Catholic religiosity, especially among young people, is seen as something from the past. And this tension explains why many of the women I spoke to emphasized how crucial it is to build and maintain meaningful relationships with other Catholics. As Hannah explained to me, these relationships are essential, and I quote her, "to nurture faith." And Ilse, who I mentioned earlier, also talked about how much she needed other believers, other Catholic believers, to sustain her religious life. And she said, and I quote, "Personally, I feel the need to meet other believers and exchange ideas with them, people with similar but also different perspectives. Because as a Christian on your own, you are lost. You really need each other," end quote. This idea that in a secular society you cannot maintain your faith entirely on your own resonated strongly with many of the women I interviewed. For many of them, religious life is structured through embodied everyday practices, praying before bed, saying grace before meals, singing in a church choir. And through these routines, religion becomes firmly embedded in everyday life. But it is especially in the more intimate spheres of life, relationships and sexuality, that religion becomes most tangible. In a society where public religiosity is often frowned upon, relationships and sexuality become spaces where religious teachings can be negotiated and lived. Even when women do not strictly follow Catholic rules, for example, regarding sex before marriage or contraception, they still reflect deeply on these issues. And decisions are not taken lightly. There is a constant negotiation between secular norms and Catholic boundaries, particularly when it comes to intimacy. And it's precisely here that the tensions of living as a Catholic woman in a secular society become most visible, I think. Next slide, please. Thank you. As I listened to the stories of the women who took part in my study, I became very aware of how much importance they attach to effective bonds with Catholic peers, friends, and family. Most of them grew up in a practicing Catholic family, while others were raised in families that could be described as culturally Catholic. So they perhaps set up a Christmas tree, have an Easter brunch, but they're not practicing Catholics. Some of the women grew up in non-religious family and described themselves as converts, although several of them had actually been baptized as infants, which was very common for that generation. This kind of religious upbringing does not only involve being introduced to Catholic teachings, rituals, and customs, it also means growing up within a specific Catholic life world. All of the women who grew up in a Catholic family spoke very fondly about their friendships with other Catholics. They talked about being part of the Catholic youth movement, going to religious summer camps, serving as altar girls, or singing in the church choir every weekend. Activities that often came up in my conversations with them. At the same time, several women told me that those feelings of isolation and loneliness already started in childhood and our adolescence. For example, they felt misunderstood by peers because they joined the Catholic youth movement or served at Sunday Mass. As adults, these feelings of isolation are still very much present. Many women told me that they need a community of people who are like-minded, who know what it is to be Catholic, and who they don't have to explain or justify themselves. So many of the women I spoke to are still friends with people they met through the church when they were young. And several shared very touching stories about how the church was, and in many ways still is, like a home to them, a safe place where they could be themselves. For that reason, many of them still attend Catholic events, not only because they want to practice their faith, but also to meet friends, to talk, to spend time together. For example, by having a drink after Sunday Mass, or by going on a pilgrimage or religiously inspired holiday together. And at times, this made it somewhat challenging for me as a researcher to determine what my interviewees themselves considered most important in their Catholic lives, their religious identity and practice, or the social aspect, including friendships with other Catholics. And perhaps this close intertwining of religion and friendship is precisely what supports the argument I'm making here, namely that interpersonal relationships should be taken seriously if we want to understand how religiosity works, especially in contemporary secular societies. And these friendships with other Catholic youth did not only help my interviewees to nurture their faith, they also provided a kind of protection against the hostile reactions they sometimes encountered from non-religious classmates at school. Feeling different, many of the women turned to their Catholic peers for advice and emotional support. And this highlights the importance of including personal ties, such as friendships, as an important category in the study of religion. For Hanne, who did not grow up in a practicing Catholic family, friendships played a particularly central role. For her baptism as an adult, she attended courses on Catholic theology and teachings, but she explained that learning what it means to live as a Catholic through friendships was perhaps even more important. And this is something I encountered in many narratives. Catholic friends and peers are crucial conversation partners, especially when it comes to very personal topics such as relationships, marriage, and sometimes sexuality. So women as, for example, Louise, Julie, and Marthe spoke about the special bond they shared with their friends, but also with their sister, and about how important these sisterly relationships were when thinking about how to integrate Catholicism into their daily lives. Marthe, for example, told me about the close bond she has with her sibling and how they often discuss religious issues together. Although her youngest sister did not participate in church activities, they still talk about their shared faith. And Marthe explained when her sister has deeper questions, she turns to her siblings rather than to her non-religious friends, because she feels that they simply would not understand. And I quote Marthe, my youngest sister, for example, doesn't feel the need to do a lot of religious activities. She goes to Mass every week, and I can talk to her about faith and so on, but she never goes to any youth activity of the church. She doesn't need it. She has her own circle of friends, and they are not religious. But when she has deep questions, she comes to us, her siblings, because she knows I can't share this with my non-religious friends because they wouldn't understand. That said, while friendship and family ties are clearly central in the religious lives of my interviewees, they also spoke about moments of difference. Some women mentioned that Catholic friends wanted to wait with sex until marriage, while they themselves did not consider this principle important enough to follow. Even in these cases, however, friendship remains an important point of reference. So the social dimension of religion cannot be ignored. Next slide, please. Thank you. What stands out across all these narratives is a strong emphasis thus on interpersonal relationships. When the women reflected on their youth and their religious journeys, none of them described becoming or remaining Catholic as a purely individual choice. Of course, they all said that at a certain point they consciously decided to identify as Catholic and to become involved in the church. As Marta put it, and I quote her, "I think it's wonderful that I received this faith from my parents, but at a certain point you decide yourself whether you continue with it or not." End quote. At the same time, they also emphasized parents, siblings, and other family members, introducing them to the Catholic Church. And Julie described this process very vividly. She explained to me how, as a young child, she went to Mass with her parents because they went to church every week. And she participated in parish activities, sang in a children's choir, and met her best friends there. And I quote Julie, "My parents are both very Catholic, and I went to Mass with my parents. And yes, as a 5, 6, or 7-year-old, you don't really think about that. And we, the children, gradually got more involved, even when we were little. In the beginning, it was in the parish. The first thing I remember is that as a small child, I was allowed to go to the front at the consecration and had to light a candle. So I thought that was, well, that's funny. But yeah, I thought it was really cool to do that. And then there was also a children's choir that sang every week, where I also really enjoyed singing. And I actually met my best friends there. I was then also able to join at the parish center. And so it was actually kind of an interplay, because of course my parents were the ones who got me involved, which is why I took part in all these initiatives from the parish. But even if it hadn't been about faith, I would have loved it anyway. I would have, well, yeah, it's actually an interplay between the importance of faith and the initiative that came about. So looking back, Julie described this as an interplay between faith, family involvement, and social activities. Even if it not had been about religion, she said, she would still have loved being part of it. And her story is quite representative of what I heard from many other interviewees. Religion and relationships develop together, shaping one another. Moreover, the life stories I collected also show a great diversity in family backgrounds and in the role families played while these women were growing up. And Louise's story is a good example of how families can not only shape ideas and motivations, but also over time transform them. During my first conversation with Louise, she appeared very firm, perhaps even strict in her views on gender and sexuality. She was determined not to have sex before her wedding day and seemed somewhat judgmental of Catholics who did not adhere to this tradition. And when I spoke to her again a few years later, however, she presented a very different perspective. She was much more open-minded, particularly when it came to sex before marriage. And when I told her how surprised I was by this change compared to our first conversation, she explained to me that in the time between the first and the second interview, she had left her parents' house and was now living on her own. And living independently allowed her to distance herself from the morals and values that her strict Catholic parents had instilled in her, and to think about these issues in a more critical and more personal way. And importantly, this shift did not mean that she stopped identifying as Catholic. Rather, she described it as a process of discovering what Catholicism and its teachings meant for herself. So she told me that her parents were quite traditional and had always taught her and her siblings that sexuality should only take place within the context of a marriage, and that premarital sex should be avoided altogether. And as she explained, she has begun to distance herself from this position by the time of her second interview. And she put it this way, and I quote her, "I have so much respect for my parents, and I think it suits them perfectly to think about sexuality in a more traditional way. And I think it's absolutely fine for them to act like that. And I think that I also taken great things from it. But I think nowadays they're a bit too fanatical for who I am." End quote. So looking back, Louise said that when she was growing up, her parents taught her felt like the truth. Today, she explained she has developed her own truth, something she never expected that would happen, but which did nonetheless. And a similar story illustrating to how women's lives are shaped by a combination of different influences can be found in Linde's case. Linde also grew up in a Catholic family and described her parents, especially her mother, as quite traditional. And at the time of the interview, she was making plans together with her boyfriend to move in with him. And she told me, and I quote her, "I think it's important to live together first and then get married." That did lead to a lot of discussions with my parents, because at first they didn't support that idea. But over time, they've also come to see why it matters to me. For me, it feels like a logical step. First living together and then getting married. Because by living together, you really get to know each other better in different aspects of life. And that makes it easier to fully commit to each other within a marriage. And then I asked her, do your parents have a more traditional view on this, where you first get married and then start living together? And she replied by saying yes, especially my mother. My father doesn't really like to talk about it that much, but I know that for my mother, it was very important to get married first. And the sexual aspects played a big role in that as well. No sex before marriage. For her, the question was very much, why would you move in together before you're married? She found that very difficult. We're 4 children at home, and all 4 of us have a partner. I'm the only one who's still living at home, but all my siblings live together with their partners before getting married. The discussions don't really happen anymore now. My mother is okay with it these days, but I do think that in the past, it would really have been considered a scandal if someone moved in together before marriage and, as you would have seen it, lived a life of sin. And this story shows how Linde's choices and decisions take shape in different ways. We can see how important it is for her to live together with her boyfriend before getting married, because she feels that this is necessary to truly get to know each other and eventually to be able to commit fully to one another in a Catholic marriage. This decision is not only grounded in her own reflections and in conversations with her partner, but also clearly influenced by the example of her siblings. All of them chose not to follow the Catholic traditions of waiting until the wedding day to have sex, even though this went against their parents' wishes. Although Linde's decision and that of her siblings initially met with comprehension from their parents and led to discussions, Linde ultimately stood by her choice. And at the same time, she refers to earlier periods in which moving in together before marriage was seen as scandalous. By doing so, she implicitly points to the fact that social norms and moral expectations have changed over time. Next slide, please. Thank you. And in addition to family relationships, I'm now moving on to the 4th theme. Many of the women I interviewed who had a Catholic partner emphasized how strongly their intimate relationship is and how much it was intertwined with religion. Marjorie, one of my interlocutors, put it very clearly, and I quote her, "Yeah, it's really important for us. Religion connects us on a certain level in a way that few other things could do." So Marjorie was married with a Catholic man. And for these couples, so a Catholic woman with a Catholic man, religion was very much part of their everyday life together. They prayed or sang together during the day or before meals, attended church services together, and sometimes went on religiously inspired holidays together, for example, to pilgrimage sites such as Lourdes in France, or by participating together in World Youth Day. And these shared practices were an important part of their relationship. Often it was also the case that they had met each other within a religious setting, for instance, through the Catholic youth movement. And almost all of the women I spoke to said that having a religious partner was very important to them. And for many of them, it was even essential. They explained to me that being in a relationship with a Catholic partner meant that certain things simply did not need to be explained. Their partner understood what they were talking about, how they felt, and what they experienced. They shared similar values and a common outlook on life, including ethical questions that were important to them. That said, not all participants had a Catholic partner. A small number of women were in relationships with partners who were not Catholic and did not belong to any religious tradition. Most of these women said that it was not necessarily a problem because they shared many other aspects, important aspects in life. And they also emphasized that their partners respected their religious lifestyle and did not make an issue of their faith. Nevertheless, these relationships were not without negotiations or challenges, particularly when it came to religious matters. One recurring example that often came up in several interviews was a question of getting married in the church. Even when partners were supportive, this could still be a point of discussion or compromise. At the same time, many women pointed out that finding a Catholic partner was not easy. Several interviewees described Catholic men, especially non-ordained men, as relatively scarce within Catholic groups. And as a result, some women developed a more pragmatic outlook on this issue. One of my interviewees put it as follows, and I quote her, "If having a Catholic partner is really an absolute requirement, then I'll be probably searching for a very long time," end quote. Importantly, the presence of a Catholic partner, so for the women who do have a Catholic partner, does not eliminate negotiation. Even in relationships where both partners are Catholic, compromises are made, highlighting that religion is often differently lived, interpreted, and practiced even within intimate relationships. A first concrete example of this intertwining of relationships and sex and religion plays out in adult life can be found in Doreen's story. Doreen told me that she and her Catholic husband wanted to avoid sex before marriage because they considered it important to follow Catholic teaching. At the same time, deciding what was possible and where the boundaries were was something that they constantly discussed together. And I quote Doreen, "It's not that we have kissed, you know. Before I got engaged, I would have said that a kiss and maybe a touch was all that could happen before we got married, but we went further than that, yes. The most important thing was that we talked about where we set the boundaries and at what point we stopped. That's actually the beauty of it. You learn to talk about sexuality in a very intimate way. It's not about whether we are ready or not. It's about what do you want or what's something you do not want," end quote. And as Doreen explained, the important thing was not strictly following a rule, but communicating openly about desires and limits. What is striking here is a constant use of we. Decisions were made together rather than individually. So we can see another layer here. Doreen's opinions changed over time, not primarily through abstract reflection, but through embodied experience within the relationship. In my conversations with Nora and Yasmin, which also focused on the topic of premarital sexuality, I encountered similar narratives about how important it is to make decisions in the intimate sphere together with your partner. Both Nora and Yasmin, who were single at the time of our conversation, felt that it was important to wait until marriage before engaging in sexual intimacy. At the same time, they emphasized that this should not be an individual decision, but one that is made and supported by both partners. Even though they personally wanted to avoid sexual experience before marriage, they were very much aware that a potential partner might not attach the same value to this principle, even a potential Catholic partner. Nora, for example, told me that she has a strong desire not to have sexual relations before her eventual marriage. She also said that this is not something she shares with everyone, because she knows that this position may sound traditional, and how many people in secular contexts regard it as old-fashioned. For her, fulfilling the Catholic expectation of waiting until marriage was extremely important. At the same time, she openly acknowledged how difficult it can be not to give in to sexual desires. And she also explained that this principle of waiting until marriage might not be completely fixed, but could be negotiable depending on the views of a future partner. And she says, and I quote her, "I'd actually like to stay true to that, but I also realize that you have to be able to talk about it, right? If waiting with sexuality is less important for that person, and it's someone who might not want that, and things are going well in other areas, then yes, we have to see what we are going to do, don't we?" I'm still wary of saying that it has to be like this for me, because you just don't know who you're going to meet. If it's only my decision, yes, but we will see. End quote. For Nora, then, communication about intimacy is is a necessary part. Much like in Doreen's story, it's about finding a shared path, one in which both partners feel comfortable with their individual desires as well as what they decide together. Moving beyond premarital sexuality, I want to turn to the example of Tina. At the time of the interview, Tina was married to a Catholic man, and together they had children. She explained to me that in principle, she's open to conceiving new life. And she linked this openness to her understanding of God's will, as it is written in the Bible, and to the church teachings on procreation and contraception. However, her husband was convinced that they should not have more children than they already have, mainly for practical reasons. So as a result, and after discussing this together with her husband, Tina decided to use contraceptives. Next slide, please. Thank you. Turning to the conclusion of this lecture and then opening the floor for questions. In this lecture, I have tried to show that the women I spoke to are navigating a deeply ambivalent position. On the one hand, Catholicism still occupies a relatively privileged place in society. On the other hand, being openly religious and especially an active practicing Catholic lifestyle often leads to misunderstanding, distance, or discomfort. And many of the women described how this results in feelings of isolation and loneliness. What emerged very clearly from their stories is how much they need other Catholics around them. Sharing faith and religious practice is not something they do alone. It happens in relationships with partners, with family members, with friends and peers who understand what it means to live as a Catholic in today's society. Rather than acting as isolated individuals who navigate religious and secular norms by themselves, their choices around relationships, sexuality, and family life are deeply relational, I would say. So decisions are made in conversation with partners, shaped by parents and siblings, and influenced by friends, and formed through lived embodied relationships. So this complicates common ideas about intimacy, but also about religion in modern societies like Belgium, where love and relationships are often framed in terms of freedom, autonomy, and individual choice. What we see here in the narratives of my interlocutors is that relationships and affective bonds really matter. They shape how these women think, feel, and act, religiously, intimately, and morally. Finally, the strong emphasis on relationships should also be understood against the backdrop of life in a post-Christian secular society. For these women, relationships with other Catholics are not only meaningful in themselves, they also offer support, recognition, and belonging in a context where being religious can feel marginal. So taking these interpersonal relationships seriously then is crucial if you want to understand how religion is lived, sustained, and negotiated in contemporary secular societies. Thank you for listening, and I'm really curious to hear your thoughts and feedback, and what you think of what I just presented.
Thank you very much, Eline. That was a very interesting and stimulating research that opens the floor to many questions, remarks. Thank you very much, Ed. Two curiosities, two remarks, two thoughts. They're not exactly questions, but then I want to leave the floor to anyone. I think there'll be plenty of questions. I think that one common prejudice or assumption that we have with Catholic women in general is that they tend to avoid questions about intimacy or sexuality, or they tend to avoid this theme, I think, to address the topic of sexuality, of intimacy. But I think that from what I understood from your research, you suggest a degree of openness, I think, in the interviews you conducted, because this is interesting, because it creates this space of renegotiation of sexuality, which is not at all avoided. It's addressed. I don't know if I understood it correctly, but I think, yeah, you overcame this. That was my prejudice. I don't know if it's shared, but I think it's pretty shared. It's that the prejudice that Catholic women tend to avoid this, or find it difficult to address this topic. But in your research and the interviews, did you encounter some difficulties in their expressing and sharing? I think it was also interesting that you mentioned that you did this interview in their house. So the domestic environment, I think it opened it created a space, a safe space in a way, but also a space of judgment, because in some cases their families wanted something for them, so it could also be a space of judgment in a way. So I was wondering if you can share your experience in this particular sense.
Yes, more than happy to. I think that the idea of this prejudice that Catholic women tend to avoid talking about these matters is also one of the reasons I did this research. You know, it's a very common topic. I remember that when I was conducting this research and I met people somewhere and they asked me, what are you doing? And I said, yeah, I'm doing a PhD on Catholic women and sexuality. Everyone was like, oh, wow, that's how are you going to find these women? And I always said, and I'm still, it's still a case. It was quite easy to find women to participate, and nearly all of them talked very open about sexuality. What is important to remark is I was always very clear about my research. So in my call for participation, it was clear that I'm doing research on Catholic women and relationships and sexuality. So people who tend to feel not comfortable to speak about that, they won't have send me an email to participate. So it's already there in the selection criteria, and the people who participated I think only the women who feel comfortable to talk about these matters will have participated in my research. So that's the first remark, of course. A second one is precisely because it's such a prejudice that many women felt the need to tell their side of the story. And that's something that I encountered during several interviews as well. It's like one of my interlocutors said, we don't seem to exist. It's always never about Catholic women. And if it's about Catholic women, people have so many prejudice about us and so many assumptions, but it's much more complicated. It's much more nuanced. And I had the feeling that several women were, so to speak, waiting for their story to be shared and to share it with me. So I didn't have the impression that it was difficult to talk about intimacy. And I think it also helped that most interviews were conducted at home, that they indeed felt comfortable. And the only women who did not want to have the interview at their home, but in a coffee bar or in a university room, perhaps those were the women who felt not very comfortable at home to talk about the experiences. That may be the case. I did not ask them. But yeah, I think with most of them, it was at home. And I think that helped to create an enjoyable atmosphere. Yeah.
Many thanks. I have another remarks, but I want to first to ask if someone from the public want to ask a question. Ci sono domande dal pubblico, magari anche in italiano, poi possiamo tradurre. Spero che con i sottotitoli, insomma, vi ha funzionato. Se no vado io, sì, c'è una domanda. Nicolò, vuoi la leggo io? Allora, Nicolò dice, thank you for your presentation. I would like to ask a question. How did these women perceive, if they did at all, the theological and ecclesial debate that is taking place publicly in many countries, including Germany, for instance, regarding sexual ethics in the Catholic Church? Have they ever publicly expressed their concerns or doubts about Catholic sexual morality within Catholic?
Yes, thank you for that question. They did not discuss debates in other European countries. They were really much focused on Flanders, which I think is understandable from their point of view. And I should also note that they were very much aware of, well, they had a certain loyalty to the church. They were all also active in the church. But most of them, well, the vast majority were not theologians. So they had a certain idea of theology and what the Bible says and what the Pope says and what the Vatican says. There were no theologians. That being said, the critique I received, or the critique they shared with me regarding sexual ethics and sexual morality, if they had criticism about that, it was nearly always about homosexuality. They found that homosexual persons should have a place in church, and that they found it completely normal to at least have a blessing for a homosexual couple. So homosexuality and LGBTQ issues were often discussed, that should be just accepted by the church. I think that also says something about the context. Flanders and Belgium was the second country, I think, worldwide that legalized gay weddings, for example. So I think that's also part of the context, that they felt that it should be, addressed by the church. Another topic that was sometimes discussed regarding sexual morality, but more reproduction, was the use of contraception. For example, the use of condoms or the use of the contraception pill. That was the second part. But for example, one of the major topics that emerged in my study was premarital sex. And well, all the women knew that officially, regarding Catholic discourses, you cannot have sexual relations before your wedding day. But they did not find it problematic that the church put it that way. It was more framed or understood as don't have sex with anyone, or don't have sex with someone you're not sure of. So if you're engaged or you have a long-term relationship, then you can have sex. But it was not that it was, they did not articulate to me that the church should change its position on this matter. The only thing that really came up was homosexuality and contraception. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Public, qualche altra domanda? Mattia?
Yes.
Mattia writes, I would like to ask, I think that in your studies, you may have read that in the last years, many Catholic communities all over the world saw the rising of individuals and communities characterized by traditional values, the so-called tradcats. Have you ever met such a girl or group of girls during your research?
That's a difficult question, as I think it's a difficult term to use, tradcats, or the same with tradwife. When it's problematic and when is it not problematic? So I did encounter women who called themselves traditional Catholic, and what they meant with that is that they identified as more conservative than average, for example. So, for example, women who did not have any sex before their wedding day, or did not use contraception, that kind of issues. In a more common way of understanding, for example, tradwives or tradcats, I did not encounter those persons. I also think it's indeed more a quite recent phenomenon, especially for the threadwives in Belgium and the Netherlands. It's more the last 2-3 years, and then my PhD was already well carried out. So I think I did my study a bit too early to capture this phenomenon that is more happening at the time. But I did encounter some, self-declared traditional Catholics. But I don't focus too much on the term traditional, not traditional, because I think it's more productive to see it as a spectrum. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. Thank you. Are there any other questions? Ci sono altre domande, magari anche da fare in chat. No, if not, I just wanted to say that something that particularly struck me and stuck with me was that isolation really, in a way, enable new forms of agency. I mean, you said that in a way it opened pathways of social mobility. It doesn't let you stuck there, but it's very, it's a catalyst for social mobility. So I think it's very, very interesting. What kind? I wanted to ask you, what kind of isolation do they experience the more? Perceived isolation in what contexts, or if you can delve more into that.
Mm-hmm. I think the isolation that struck them most is the everyday isolation. For example, I encountered quite some women who do not share at work that they're Catholic, for example. So if on Monday they're talking about their weekends and what did you do, some of them will never say, oh, I went to church yesterday morning, for example, because they have encountered so many negative responses about that. Like, why would you be Catholic nowadays? And you're so smart, you have a PhD, why are you Catholic? You know, these were actual phrases that have been said to my interviewees. Or, for example, that's also an example that often came up in the interviews was when the Pope or the Vatican had said something about homosexuals. It was always that they were being addressed about it. But hey, you're Catholic and the Pope says this. What do you think of this? So they had the idea that they always had to defend themselves, and that people were not able to accept that even if they are Catholic and the Pope says something, that they do not necessarily agree with everything the Pope says, for example. So what I said about the one of the questions that has been asked, the vast majority of women I interviewed were very open about homosexuality, and nearly all of them said that homosexual couples should have a blessing in church and should be accepted in church, and it should be just treated as other persons. So it shows to them. It shows that they were very open about these matters, but they were still, by secular society and secular peers, confronted about these topics, like, why are you Catholic? So this isolation was very much present in everyday life, in workplace, but also in friendships with non-religious persons, to not share it and hide a certain part of their life. I also met an interviewee who always wears a cross around her neck. And when she goes to a job interview, for example, or an important work event, she hides it with a scarf so that it's not visible. So that's the kind of isolation I'm talking about.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Concerning isolation, I had a question, since you said that your interviews spanned from 2019 to 2023. So you witnessed also the period of COVID-19? And did it impact or could you assess an impact of the pandemic within the self-awareness of the people you interviewed as to intimacy and their intimate life?
Yes, thanks for that question. Yeah, I noticed a very strong impact of the COVID pandemic on their lives, not necessarily on their intimate lives, but their religious lives altogether. So the second phase of my fieldwork I did through Zoom. In 2021, I did interviews through Zoom because it was not possible to physically go to their homes. And they all told me that this pandemic is, of course, it was devastating on so many levels, of course. I also had some interviewees who worked as a healthcare professional, so they noticed the huge impact. But they also said that this pandemic was very negative towards their religious practice, because for them, some of them discovered during the pandemic how embodied their faith is. So going to church, singing together, sharing a meal together, sitting next to one another in church, that was all put away through the pandemic. And they, how should I say it? The pandemic made clear to them how embodied their faith is. And I think that was an interesting finding in my study. And also it challenged the way we look at religion often in secular societies. Religion as something from your mind, it's something you believe in, something very individual. But here it really showed that it's really also an embodied practice and also a collective practice, singing together in a church, going on a pilgrimage together, walking side by side, things like that.
Thank you.
Are there any questions? Remarks collective está vencer en libertad. Thank you for the presentation. I would like to ask you, have you noticed that intimate life before marriage has influenced life after marriage, either positively or negatively, and whether there has been any evolution?
I think you mean intimate life. Well, among my interviewees, I have to say I don't have studied that, or I have not asked interviewees in changes into their intimate life. And I also noticed that they didn't tell me about it. So I assume that either they did not find it important or they did not share it with me, but I cannot answer it. I did not explicitly study it. I'm sorry.
Maybe in the future.
That would be a very good idea. I sometimes think about it, like it's been, a couple of years since my last interviews, and with the trad Catholics and the trad wives, and society has changed over the last couple of years. I think it would be really interesting to have a follow-up study. Yeah,
it's evolving. So, and what are you working on right now?
Well, I'm now developing a research project on Catholic women and non-motherhood. So Catholic women who are not mothers, and that can be voluntarily, but also involuntarily or by circumstances. So that's
just brilliant. That's going to be another stimulating seminar.
I hope so.
Yeah, so any other questions? No. Okay. Well, if there are any other questions, I thank you very much, Eline.
That's my pleasure.
Huygens, is it correct? Huygens.
Yes, it's correct. Yeah.
Because I asked my friend from the Netherlands, Thank you very much for being with us today and sharing with us your research. It's been a pleasure. It's been very interesting and stimulating. Yeah, we hope to meet soon. I don't know, either in Leuven or in Ghent or the Netherlands or in Italy.
Would be lovely.
Yeah. Yeah, Filippo, I don't know if you want to say something or no.
No, just ending with representing the Polylogos Center. I just want to thank Eline for her presence here, for the very insightful presentation. I want to thank Lucia Battistel for having chaired the meeting, and everyone and each of you for having been here. This is my second meeting as a president of Polylogos. I'm very happy that the center is continuing its activity of study, research, and above all, dissemination of knowledge, thanks to the proficiency of people like Eline Huygens. I think that we may consider ourselves satisfied for today. So have a nice evening, and thank you very much again.
Thank you.
Again, have a nice evening and hope to see you in person.
Yes.
Bye bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Grazie a tutti.
Thank you.
Buonasera. Grazie a tutti.
La registrazione